Okay, so this is the last. So this is what video number 4, I think it is, in our 70s and 80s series. This is going to end with the end of Reagan's presidency in 1988. 1988 is the election year. Of course, Ronald Reagan's not eligible to run again. His vice presidential candidate, George Herbert Walker Bush, also known as Bush 41, wins that presidency, takes over in 1989. And then it's only a year later, that we're involved in the Gulf War, and you see some of the changes happen in the 1990s. And so we'll be talking about that with the next unit. And so we're not quite there yet. So we're just going to finish talking about Ronald Reagan and kind of his impact, paying attention to kind of the conservative resurgence, kind of the backlash against liberalism that we see happening in the 1980s, as well as some of the other developments of the 1980s. And then the activities we're doing in class should kind of help expand and extend what I'm talking about here. So this is really, we talked about how 1964, you saw Barry Goldwater running, kind of perceived as the beginning of the conservative resurgence, conservative redefinition. You see Richard Nixon kind of taking that act of redefining things, of how can we, in other words, we're not going to take this, we're going to drop nuclear weapons on everybody, and so we're going to focus on kind of domestic conservatism. And we saw him doing that. Now, obviously, Nixon's administration gets fraught with problems because of Watergate, and because of the Vietnam, trying to get out of that situation. But clearly, Jimmy Carter makes a mess out of things as well. And so when we get to 1980 and get to the presidential election of that year, you have an American public that is extremely frustrated and extremely kind of down on itself. And what you're going to see is that Ronald Reagan's going to campaign in 1980 really on this idea, and it's going to sound very similar to Donald Trump, making America great again. Morning in America, that kind of stuff. It's a new day. We're going to wake up from the 1970s and all this frustration. It's going to be a whole new thing. And understand that the 1970s were definitely a frustrating period. Like I said, economically, you have stagnation, you have the influence of OPEC, you've got some global frustrations happening in the Middle East that the U.S. is struggling with. You've got all these different groups. No one that seems to be completely happy with the social equality or the economic opportunities they have. You have lots of changing people, and you've got a society really that had gone from kind of the idealism of the 60s and the hippie movement and the, make love, not war, and kind of this whole commune environment to really people that have no real sense of meaning. And so the 1970s are full of disco. They're full of, free love. They're full of do what feels good right now. And it's really kind of a selfish, kind of self-absorbed, we're tired of worrying about the world kind of period. And so there's a whole lot of fatigue and frustration. And Ronald Reagan will come in, and he'll definitely appeal on several different levels to people and really kind of promise to bring in a new phase to American society. Some of the basic definitions that you need to understand, and this is particularly relevant for this year because it's an election year, that you've got kind of this perception of liberals, right? Liberals tend to support government intervention in the economy. They don't believe that the government should micromanage people's personal lives. They believe that taxes should be paid by the wealthy to support programs, by wealthy and corporations to support programs and initiatives for the middle class and the poor. Now, obviously, that's a very simplified version of it. There's more nuances than that. And you're definitely going to see that, the question of these programs, we talked about the problems of the Great Society, when programs are not done well, what that means. And so, just because it sounds good doesn't mean it's as simple as all that. Conservatives, on the other hand, look at government and they say, the federal government tends to mess things up. They tend to make it more complicated. There's lots of unintended consequences. They start micromanaging people's lives. And they tend to want government to be very small or at least to be very local. And they tend to, particularly in the 1980s, there's a strong kind of resurgence of kind of Christian faith morality into conservatism. And that's actually kind of a new piece to this whole, conservative redefinition, conservative resurgence. Not that you hadn't had, Christianity and morality as a piece of government. But what you see is that in the 1980s, the Republican Party clearly becomes the party for evangelical Christians. Now, that's, again, a simplification because I don't think that that's always the case. I think you're going to have people of many faiths, of many degrees of commitment in both parties. But they certainly, that becomes part of their branding, I guess you could say. And so conservatives are going to talk a lot about economic freedom. They're going to kind of continue that law and order mentality that we saw with Nixon, that there's certain behaviors you shouldn't do, that this kind of hippy dippy, do whatever feels good in the moment is not the way we want to have society. And so conservatives are going to tend to position themselves as being very anti-communist, being very anti-atheist. And liberals are going to tend to support this idea of civil rights. And most importantly, they have a very different position on what the government's supposed to be doing. Now, understand that this is a very simplistic approach to understanding liberals and conservatives, and that in reality, right, that it's a spectrum and people fall within all kinds of shades of that spectrum. And to try to say it's all one or all the other is really doing a disservice. And what you'll find is it makes it very hard to choose a candidate because, he's a liberal candidate. Well, maybe I don't agree with this policy, or maybe I agree with that policy. There can be a huge range there. But understand that in the 1980s, we start to really divide groups into one or the other. And I think it's important for you to kind of recognize that, and recognize that Reagan really capitalizes on that. He capitalizes on this kind of division. And of course, it's not helped by the fact that there's a lot of economic frustration, and people look at the Great Society programs and they look at Jimmy Carter, and they kind of take out their angst against the Democrats in a lot of ways. And against anyone who's perceived as liberal. And because you see under Reagan, he kind of makes that a dirty word, or at least kind of eye rolling, kind of, oh, they're liberal, and so it really kind of changes our perception. And I think it's important for you guys to understand as we go into the 21st century, and we're going into an election year, that we definitely have kind of that perception, and it comes from the 1980s. And I've just got a series of cartoons here you can take time to look at if you're interested, kind of making fun of the different definitions of liberal and conservative, and how we tend to make these blanket statements and that kind of thing. How do the conservatives gain support? Well, I've touched on it a little bit already. Notice that I mentioned it in the 1950s. They began to organize and become more coherent. Part of this is a response to the New Deal. Part of it's a response to Truman. You've got the Dixiecrats that emerged because they didn't like the, civil rights legislation. You're going to see that the social movements, the civil rights movements, the Great Society. And I mentioned how with LBJ, he knew he was going to be losing a segment of the South. And this is really where the South turns red, turns Republican. And, to what extent does this have to do with, religious values and kind of the perception of liberalism and kind of the 60s and 70s, or how much of it has to do with the civil rights movement and kind of the backlash against that? I mean, that's up to you to decide. But very clearly, the southern states turn red. They become Republican. And you start to see a real emphasis in the conservative community to create think tanks, right? The Heritage Foundation is one of those. Another recent one is called the Bill of Rights Foundation. These are think tanks in the sense that they are nonprofit funded organizations that really exist to do research, to dig into statistics and to analyze statistics and kind of give their own particular slant. Now, understand that there's, quote unquote, liberal think tanks as well. The Brookings Institute is one that often gets slammed for being somewhat liberal, although I'm not sure that I agree with that. But you've basically got groups that get funded. It's like saying, I have a product and I want to do research on it, so I'm going to hire a firm to do research for me. right? Well, if I'm paying for that research, then obviously that research is going to tend to say what I want it to say, or at least we're going to find a way to present it that way. And so that's one of the issues. So you need to be familiar with the Heritage Foundation. Heritage Foundation is listed on our standards. Why exactly, I'm not completely sure, except that I do think that it does help you to understand that there are these organizations that are funded, that are designed to kind of collect information and help kind of send information out to people. So if you ever hear of a study or a poll by the Heritage Foundation, you need to assume that it's going to have kind of this conservative / Republican slant to it. That's going to tend to mean we want smaller government, we want more religion, we want more of this, that kind of thing. The next thing that we see is the Sun Belt, which is the southern and western part of America. And I mentioned before that with the decline of American manufacturing in the 1970s, i.e. the Rust Belt in the Midwest and the North, people started moving down south, right? And that was facilitated by the creation, by widespread use of air conditioning. And so the Sun Belt starts voting Republican. And a lot of this has to do with this idea of individualism and local control. And I don't want somebody telling me what to do. Although sometimes we can tell other people what to do, right? There's secret irony there. And you're going to tend to see that the suburbs are going to reject the tax burdens that were being shifted to them. This is one of the issues that comes in. We touched on the Edgewood v. Kirby case with Texas and school finance. And one of the issues there is that, suburbs wanted to be able to pay for their own schools and have their own good schools. Well, Edgewood v. Kirby says, no, you can't do that because that inherently makes certain neighborhoods have poorer schools than others. And so this is kind of part of that, right? And so this is also part of the transition under Nixon of the Great Society programs from federal control to local control. Well, as we shift some of these programs to a local control perspective, you're going to have neighborhoods that are going to say, I don't want to pay for a Great Society program in the middle of Dallas. I don't live in the middle of Dallas. I live in Sunnyvale. I live in Garland. I live in Rowlett. I want to pay for my own community. I don't want to pay for their. And so you're going to start to have some restructuring, and that a lot of that begins with Nixon's move towards new federalism and shifting local control. And again, this is very much a part of kind of that conservative redevelopment. And of course, what will happen is that you have suburbs that don't want to take responsibility. And I mentioned before that this is what will allow for the differences in funding between certain states, even within states, right? Another big development of conservatives is going to be religious groups. We have really, I think, in a way that's somewhat, you haven't seen it since like the colonial time, right? When you had, the Puritans controlling politics in Massachusetts. Beginning in the 1980s, you're going to see the evangelical movement's really going to become politically active. They're really going to, engage in this political system. Churches are going to be very politically active, very, raising money, having speakers. This is why you have, what was it? A year ago, 6 months ago, you had Prestonwood Baptist Church hosted a Republican debate. This is why we see churches getting involved now, right? And, you can decide for yourself whether you think that's appropriate. But the reality is it starts in the 1980s with Jerry Falwell creating the moral majority. This is kind of a loose group of various religious denominations that have kind of moral standards that are based on biblical values. And they really kind of press and kind of become a lobbying group to influence politics and that kind of thing. And again, you're going to have churches that do that. And the moral majority will endorse certain candidates over others. You're going to see somebody by the name of Phyllis Schlafly. One of the activities we'll do in classes will be looking at the Equal Rights Amendment. The Equal Rights Amendment was an amendment for the Constitution that was specific to say that we were equal regardless of gender. It didn't matter what sex you were, right? And so that bill passes through Congress. It goes to the states for ratification. And once it goes to the states for ratification, you have this conservative group led by Phyllis Schlafly that comes out really saying that the Equal Rights Amendment is going to lead to the decline of the family, and that, gays and, the sexual behavior of the 70s and all that is due to the fact that we've got these loose morals and women have now stopped taking care of their families and they're working, and really kind of blamed some of the social problems of the 70s on women in a lot of ways. And Phyllis Schlafly kind of gained support in state legislatures, campaigning, and basically the Equal Rights Amendment never gets ratified because she was able to successfully galvanize people to say that this is going to permanently change gender roles. What I find very amusing is that one of the things she argued against was that she said, oh, women will be fighting in the military and women won't be taking care of their kids and all this she had all these really dire predictions. And then the Equal Rights Amendment failed, but in reality, women continued to gain rights and gain equality, probably due a lot to Title IX and education opportunity, and the affirmative action policies that create economic opportunity. But these conservative groups that kind of based their values in kind of religious beliefs become very powerful in the 1980s in shaping kind of philosophies, and really kind of the resonance that they get really kind of shows you kind of the values of the United States in the 1980s. You have a great deal of fatigue with trying to fix everything, and kind of this attitude that maybe people need to be held responsible for their own behavior. And there's certainly some truth to that. Remember, one of the consequences of the Great Society program is that it creates a cycle of dependency. And so, you definitely see that this conservative resurgence is a part of that. And it's got some good things to it, and it's also got some negative things to it. But you do need to be familiar with concepts like the moral majority and who Phyllis Schlafly and Jerry Falwell and who the Heritage Foundation were, and how they reflect kind of this shift away from liberalism towards conservatism by most Americans, and become really very vocal in shaping politics. So Ronald Reagan was, he was an actor at one point, kind of a B-list actor. He wasn't like Oscar winning or anything like that. Bedtime for Bozo or Bonzo or something like that was one of his movies. Anyways, he becomes very active in kind of California politics. In fact, one of the ways that he and Nancy Reagan, which Nancy Reagan just passed away, they met in part because she had gotten in trouble with kind of been accused of collaborating with communists. And Ronald Reagan was kind of in charge of one of the committees that kind of investigated people, and he kind of cleaned it up for her. And they fell madly in love and got married and all that kind of stuff. So anyways, you definitely see Ronald Reagan works his way up through the California political system. Very much, and I've mentioned this before, that California has really kind of two camps politically. You've got the far left, and when I say far left, I mean far left. We're not talking moderate left. You've got some very powerful pockets of liberalism in California, but you also have just as powerful pockets of conservatism. And so California is really a state with kind of two political faces on it. And he's going to be very powerful through the California conservative machine, work his way up as governor of California. And so he runs in 1980, promising for kind of this new day for America. And he kind of talks about the positives of America and the strength of America, and we're going to be strong again. Really strikes a different tone than what we had seen with Jimmy Carter, who talked about how, was constantly referring to America's problems and how we needed to fix the problems. And Reagan was like, no, America's great. We're awesome. And we're going to be able to fix this. Whatever's going on, we're going to take care of it because that's who we are. And we fought World War II and, all this kind of stuff. And so he definitely comes in. He embraces what we call Reaganomics. And you need to be familiar with this term. Now, Reaganomics is actually kind of a variation of the 1920s supply side economics that I had explained to you several months ago, where the idea is that we control interest rates. We don't want interest rates to get too low. We don't want them to get too high. We want to kind of keep them, kind of the low side of middle. But we're also going to cut taxes. We're going to cut taxes a lot. We're going to deregulate businesses so businesses have room to grow and expand. And by cutting taxes for individuals and corporations, and by deregulating industry, and by cutting government spending, we're going to kind of stimulate economic growth. And if you remember me saying, this was something that probably should have been done in 1977, right? And so this is definitely the right time for this kind of economic policy, and it is incredibly successful, right? It does stimulate economic growth. In fact, economic growth goes crazy, and it was time. This is what the economy needed. So it was a good policy. So you need to understand that Reaganomics is kind of this attitude of cutting taxes, decreasing deregulation, reducing the size of government, controlling interest rates in order to stimulate economic growth. And you need to understand that it works. Also understand that he doesn't just apply Reaganomics. He also does a lot of defense spending. He comes out very harshly against communism. He's going to be very vocal against communism. And he's going to turn to military spending. And he's going to use kind of building up, to challenge the communists as an excuse for that. Well, military spending is classical government programs, right? So one of the things that I think is kind of interesting is that while you have this very much this Reaganomics, this supply side economic policy that cuts taxes to stimulate growth, you also have happening at the same time government spending through the military. And remember, that's also kind of a short-term economic boom. And so all of these things work together to really increase the economy and improve the economy and really take care of the stagflation. So the 1980s are going to be a booming period economically. We'll talk about some of his defense ideas, this idea of the Strategic Defense Initiative, which was they called it, the nickname for it was Star Wars, that you could shoot missiles into the sky and destroy nuclear weapons before they went off and that kind of thing. Never actually gets developed, but the threat of developing it terrifies the Soviet Union. Lots of conventional weapons, lots of missiles. So even regardless of the SALT I and SALT II treaties, you see Ronald Reagan really kind of embracing building up the military again, and his, and this is going to apply a lot of pressure to the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union that had kind of gotten a chance to take a breath under Nixon, and even with Carter, even though Carter kind of sours the relationship, we're not building up weapons, right? I mean, they're not having to focus on that. Well, now all of a sudden, here comes Reagan, and he's saying, oh, no, we're going to start building weapons again. And the economic power of the Soviet Union just isn't there anymore. They don't have the resources to fund that kind of military development, and they don't have the capitalism, the free market to kind of support that. And so this is going to be one of the major factors that are going to trigger Soviet Union into collapse. Here you can see a picture of Reagan and Nancy Reagan. This is after there was an assassination attempt on him in 1981, and so anyways, he ends up being fine, but you definitely, that picture was right after he got out of the hospital. Other major events, so sorry, the American hostages are freed right after he takes the oath of office. That's kind of a big deal. He appoints two conservative Supreme Court justices, Sandra Day O'Connor, the first woman, so you need to recognize her name. She pops up on the STAR test periodically. Antonin Scalia, who just passed away, was nominated by Ronald Reagan. He very easily wins the 1984 election. The economy has boomed. That election is known for vice presidential candidate for the Democrats, Geraldine Ferraro, as the first woman candidate. And I mentioned his failed assassination attempt in March 1981. This is really kind of the beginning of the gun control debate, because this John Hinckley Jr. Was not mentally stable, decides to shoot Ronald Reagan to thinking that it will make Jodie Foster fall in love with him. Again, he wasn't mentally stable, but he was able to get his hands on a gun. So you start to have these conversations going back as far as 1981, guys, is when we've been talking about what should we do about gun control? I don't know, we will see the space shuttle program. One of the other kind of government incentives or government spending programs he creates is the space shuttle program as a way to kind of bring a ship rather than just sending something up there and having it millions and millions of dollars wasted, to being able to bring these shuttles back. And so you start the space shuttle program, and it's very successful. I remember when the first one took off. 1986, you have the Challenger explosion, due to some cuts and some rapid development, that kind of thing. You're also going to see the war on drugs, the Just Say No campaign. Crack cocaine becomes incredibly dangerous in the 1980s. And again, a lot of this is dovetails with kind of the new federalism, the local control, the lack of government programs, because under Ronald Reagan, we're cutting those social programs. Yes, we're spending more on defense, we're spending more on the space shuttle program, but we're not spending nearly as much on Great Society programs. And because we're not doing that, it's starting to hurt these kind of inner cities, and you're going to have kind of in this vacuum that's left by the Great Society programs, you're going to see gang activity and drug activity and drug usage, which of course had been fairly popular, in the late 60s and 70s. Really begins to take on a whole new level in the 1980s, and there are a lot of conversations about how drugs became more powerful, more strong, and it wasn't the same kind of stuff that they used in 68 at Woodstock, that kind of thing. So just kind of, you want to be sure the Just Say No campaign. Just Say No campaign was really an attempt to convince young people to just say no, right? Just say no to drugs. And Nancy Reagan got a lot of criticism for that. That was her kind of, Michelle Obama has kind of a platform on physical fitness. Well, for Nancy Reagan, it was just say no. And this is part of the larger kind of concept of the war on drugs, which of course, if you know anything about the criminal justice system and some of the criticisms of it right now, there are lots of people that say that the war on drugs has helped create this kind of cycle of criminal behavior by throwing people in jail who are really committing harmless crimes, which is a whole nother, that's a whole nother rabbit trail. But just now you need to be familiar with the Just Say No campaign, and that it was under Ronald Reagan that this concern about drug usage becomes a big deal. Reagan's foreign policy is increasing the conventional military. He basically increases deficit spending. So yes, we're cutting taxes, we're cutting government programs, but we're spending more money. And if you think back to the 1920s in supply side economics, that's what you're not supposed to do, right? But he's doing a little bit of both, right? And worrying about how we'll figure out the deficit later, because his whole goal is to strengthen the economy. So he has this policy called peace through strength, that if we have a strong military, if we're the strongest military in the world, nobody will mess with us. Again, he starts to send aid to Afghanistan to fight the Soviets. He'll send aid to the Contras in Nicaragua. And there's a whole interesting kind of side story with that. There's a thing called, and we'll watch in class this little clip on the Iran-Contra scandal. But in a nutshell, Congress, of course, remember after Nixon, after LBJ's Gulf of Tonkin resolution with Nixon, they passed the War Powers Act that says, President, you can only do so much. Well, they have another piece of legislation that basically says that the president cannot send American dollars to fund groups without congressional approval. Okay, basically a way of creating oversight on how covert operations kind of work. And in the meantime, you've got a National Security Council that's also kind of working on the side as well. And so what you have is that Ronald Reagan feels very passionately about stopping the spread of communism and wants to send aid not only to Afghanistan, but also to Nicaragua. And he finds ways around that. And the Iran-Contra scandal is the most noticeable one of that, because it truly violates kind of the congressional checks and balances and some of the amendments that Congress had come up with to control the president and what he's able to do in covert operations. And this will come out and it'll just look really bad for Ronald Reagan. He doesn't actually get convicted of any kind of wrongdoing, and everybody involved in it kind of gets pardoned, or they their case gets dismissed on appeal, that kind of thing. But just know that towards the end of his presidency, 86, 87, it really makes him look pretty bad. So you're going to have him trying to find ways to send money. And of course, it's interesting with Iran-Contra because he's dealing with Iran, which, of course, we had supposedly they didn't like us and we weren't real happy with them after the Iranian hostage crisis. But very clearly, we were willing to work with them, and ironically, willing to work with them through Israel. So again, you've got more of us dabbling kind of in these ways in the Middle East and that kind of thing, and messing with countries in Central America. So just kind of keep that in mind. And like I said, this video will kind of explain it a little more clearly when we watch it in class. And again, I mentioned the Strategic Defense Initiative putting pressure. Mikhail Gorbachev will take over in the Soviet Union, and I can't remember the exact year. Is it 84, 85, something like that? And he'll come in, and he's really kind of a new president. And when he comes in, he recognizes that the Soviet Union has really fallen behind, that things have not been managed well, that they don't have any kind of market stimulus, that growth and opportunity has really kind of stagnated. And, some of the same issues that we've seen talking about the Great Society programs are going to be kind of present there with, removing people's initiative and stifling growth and that kind of thing. And so Gorbachev is going to create what he calls a period of glasnost, which is a term kind of for easing, kind of a return to easing the tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union. He and Reagan began to have a real dialogue with each other, again, negotiations, engagement with each other. Even as Ronald Reagan is continuing to put pressure on the Soviets and on Gorbachev by keeping up the defense spending, putting pressure on them. And we'll read in class his Berlin Wall speech about, we're going to tear down this wall. It's up to you. We're not going to back down. You have to take the first step. And you're going to have this kind of process of perestroika, which is an opening of Russian society. And this is really where we begin to see the cracks happening as far as the collapse of the Soviet Union. By the time you get to 1989, after Reagan has left office, you've got the Berlin Wall crumbling down. By 91, the Soviet Union no longer exists, and it's become Russia and the Ukraine and all these other countries again. So understand that Reagan's foreign policy, this kind of pressure that he's putting on the Soviet Union, even as he's engaging in a conversation with Gorbachev. The way he handles that is very crucial to ending the Cold War and bringing about an end to that. And you can't really take that away from him. Now, understand that some of this starts with Nixon as well. But it's Reagan who really kind of brings it to the end, and that kind of thing. So there's a picture of Reagan and Gorbachev, and shows you a picture of where Nicaragua is, and the Iran-Contra scandal. And again, this has to do a lot with kind of resisting communism all over the world. Other characteristics of the 1980s, the economic boom leads to a major focus on money and business. This is kind of the high point. You've got this period of deregulation. If you're familiar with the movie Wall Street, greed is good. Stockbrokers, yuppies, young urban professionals, kind of this idea of I want to work and make as much money as I can, and I want to drive a Porsche, and I want to do all this kind of stuff. Major retail industry emerges, this whole concept of the indoor mall, which we've actually kind of moved away from now in the 21st century. But you certainly had lots of emphasis on retail consumption and consumerism. And most importantly, we have technology, right? Cable television, bringing MTV into the houses, and people having, 70, 100, 200 channels to watch. I mean, this was unheard of in 1980, right? Computers, the first, personal computers, Apples, Macs, you name it. Cell phones, big cell phones that we had in the 1980s, video games. I heard it just the other day. I watched the movie Pixels, right? So you definitely have those kinds of things. Music videos create this kind of pop culture. And really the 1980s are kind of the beginning. I mean, technology emerges I mean, if you're talking about the computer, I mean, you're going back to World War II, really. But it's not until the 1970s that you have this development of personal computing in a way that's going to really shape and change everything. And so I think it's very important for you to understand the role of technology and computers, especially in changing the world that we live in and the world that you guys live in 2016, which understand you're talking, 35 years since the 1980s is so different than the world I lived in when I was a teenager in the 1980s. So it's completely different. Even the way I'm recording this right now using a Chromebook that really is just an internet platform device, right? And I'm recording my voice, and you're going to watch it on YouTube. I mean, this stuff would have been unheard of back in the day, right? So just understand the role of computers in developing this technology and changing the world in which we live. Of course, in the 1980s, you don't have the internet, not a fully developed internet. That doesn't come till the 1990s. But you certainly have personal computing increasing efficiency, increasing what people can do at work and what people can do at home, increasing people's ability to stay in contact, and this new pop culture that really comes from MTV, that comes from music videos and video games and all this kind of stuff, and just really kind of this attitude of we want to consume and buy as much as we possibly can. And here's some funny pictures of just different technology and stuff from the 1980s. Other big problems that I want to point out, and I've touched on this a little bit, the slash in government programs and the corporate profits lead to a very wide wealth gap. And I touched on this a little bit when I mentioned that the suburbs didn't want to pay the taxes to help the inner cities. And this is part of that wealth gap, right? People who are able to make money because of the economic growth of the 1980s want to keep their money. They want to keep as much of it as they possibly can. And they don't care what's happening in the inner cities. And so that's going to mean that their crime and drugs and alcohol are going to really get out of hand in the 1980s. And this is where the war on drugs comes from, and, accusations about crack cocaine being, sent by the government. You're going to have those kinds of things happening. Also, you're going to see in 1984, the drinking age is going to be increased to the 21. That's going to be in part because of kind of that conservative resurgence, right? These groups, conservative groups that are going to talk about, these young people drinking and driving and all this kind of stuff. And so this drinking age of 21 is very much a part of the conservative resurgence. AIDS, the acquired immune deficiency syndrome, which, its precursor is HIV, the human immunodeficiency virus. That first gets diagnosed in the 1980s. The first few cases started popping up in the late 70s, but they didn't really figure out what it was until the 1980s. And of course, it first targeted gay men. And so the initial reaction was like, well, we don't care. It's affecting gay men. It's affecting, intravenous drug users. We don't care. Well, then it started to affect other people, people who were heterosexual or people who got blood transfusions. So one of the kind of stories about AIDS in the 1980s is that Ronald Reagan was not very interested in sending money to that, right? He was not a big social issues guy. He wanted to instead focus on military spending and tax cuts and deregulation. And so there's a lot of tension by groups saying that he's not acting fast enough. And so there's a lot of push to address the AIDS movement. And you have celebrities, Elizabeth Taylor and Michael Jackson, come out, Elton John, in support of the AIDS research and that kind of thing. And it really, a lot of what we've seen happen since then is that we began to realize that we did have to address this concern, and we did have to do something about it. And so that's why we've made the improvements we have with AIDS treatments. But it really starts in the 1980s, and I can't overstate to you enough. I mean, I was a teenager in the 1980s. I remember in 84, 83, when they didn't know exactly how AIDS was transmitted. And they were still, why were heterosexuals getting it? Was it transferred by mosquitoes? Was it transferred on a toilet seat? Was it transferred in saliva? And people were terrified of what could happen, if you got HIV. And it was really, it was a death sentence within a couple of years, and so it was really a terrifying thing. The best way I can compare it is Ebola. right? Of course, Ebola is actually much more fast acting than AIDS, but that was kind of the level of fear there. You have a lot of artists, musicians, environmentalists really begin to be vocal. Rap music, of course, it's really emerges in the 1980s as kind of an activist call. The Live Aid, the Farm Aid movement, the musicians getting together, the We Are the World, that kind of thing. All these different movements to try to raise awareness and get people to pay attention are all a part of drawing attention to these problems, even as the United States still continues to remain very conservative, very focused on kind of making money and taking care of its local communities. Understand also that apartheid is in South Africa. That's a global concern, and that doesn't really kind of start to get resolved until the end of the 80s, early 90s. In fact, Nelson Mandela was considered a terrorist by Ronald Reagan for a long time because of his group that was challenging South Africa, the South African regime that was in favor of apartheid. And of course, we've got these simmering problems of terrorism in the Middle East that we just can't quite seem to get rid of. And so you can see here just a few pictures. The one picture is of AIDS quilts, kind of documenting the number of people who had died from AIDS. You can see a picture of a police car and the crime in the inner cities, real inner city blight in a level like, think Detroit today, but happening in all kinds of cities all around the world. And of course, the drug usage. And, Nancy Reagan, just say no, just say no to drugs. If any of you ever watched the Goldbergs on ABC on Wednesday nights, they had a really funny episode a few months ago where the mom decided to get involved in the Just Say No campaign at the school. And but I mean, it is pretty funny when you look back on it. But at the time, it was a big part of our culture. And Mr. T and all these famous people, just say no to drugs. In the meantime, you had celebrities, lots of celebrities engaging in drug usage. But again, the drugs were becoming more dangerous in the 1980s. So you had a lot more people going to rehab and that kind of thing because it was no longer casual usage like it was in the 1960s. So that takes us through the 1980s, through Ronald Reagan's presidency. There we go. And we'll pick up, we'll be doing some in-class activities. The test that we'll take will be on the 70s and 80s. And then next we'll be looking at the 90s and 2000s. And we'll talk about George Herbert Walker Bush 41. And we'll talk about the Gulf War and the emergence of the internet and those kinds of things as we move into the 2000s and Clinton and kind of his own scandals in the 1990s and that sort of thing. All righty, so this is the last one.